doing?
So this week, Darlie Routier, and this is one you introduced to me.
Darlie Routier.
This is one that I am surprised I didn't know about, and I'm really glad you introduced it to me because I went down a rabbit hole and a half reading and just even my wife and I were looking. There's so many documentaries out there.
Oh yeah,
and this case has so many talking points, which I'm really looking forward because we haven't. This is one of the few times where we've been quite good about not really showing our hands on what we think to a degree, and I'm glad that we've done that this week.
Yes. We haven't done that this week. So I'll be curious. You before we started recording, you referred to the idea that you already have developed a theory. I'll be interested to see if your theory does not change as we have an active back and forth discussion.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting to track. But
yes.
I mean, it's certainly a case that it's one of these ones. I think what it's good for, and I had pointed you to the podcast Serial when we were discussing stuff, and and for anybody who's listening to this, if you're bothering to listen to this, I'm sure you probably know what Serial is, but just in case, it was a long form podcast done by some of the folks associated with This American Life, which is in turn associated with NPR out of Chicago in the United States. And it followed the case of a young kid named Adnan Syed, who was convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend, Hai Min Lee. And that podcast wound up being I think they wound up drawing quite a bit of backlash in some senses, but I think people sort of took it for something it wasn't. What it wound up becoming was sort of a meditation, for lack of a better term, on the nature of knowledge, on almost epistemology itself. Like how can anyone know anything? And what is it what is reasonable doubt? What is beyond a reasonable doubt? These are great philosophical questions for a judicial system that depends on these, frankly, somewhat loose concepts. And so, anyway, I think the Darlie Routier case, really falls within that as well. It's a good one because, I tell my students all the time when I teach deconstruction, which is for those of you who may not have heard it, in literary circles, it's a form of literary interpretation. And the notion of deconstruction is that any text, when you start analyzing it, like any good text, worthy of being called literature, when you start analyzing it at its closest level, like if you try to spin one singular meaning and say, like, let's say Shakespeare's Hamlet is about, the nature of indecision and valor and honor, right? Just as a concept, that the more you study it closely, the more that as you attempt to impose a narrative of this is what this play is about, the more you're going to find that actually unwinds. And it can, in fact, even turn out to be almost thematically the opposite of what you originally thought. And so deconstruction, in other words, is just saying that really good texts have so much to them that they tend to break down at the microscopic level so that you can it's hard to pin a single meaning to a great literary text. And the example I use with them, and of course, the guy who developed this notion actually used Franz Kafka's, of all ironic things here, since what we're talking about today, The Trial, as sort of the central piece of what he, as he launched into his own conversation on this. He reproduced a piece of that novel called The Trial. And what I say to my students is that think about what a real trial actually is. It's not about the seeking of truth. The prosecution doesn't really care about the truth. The defense doesn't really care about the truth. It's about presenting competing narratives assembled from the same evidence. And then, basically putting it to a jury and asking them to pick the story that they like.
Yeah. And this case, I think that's a really good, I don't know if you want to call them sort of an analogous story or a set of circumstances that you've presented, because that was my impression when I first, I guess from my perspective, forgetting my views on what actually happened. I think I'm amazed as far as how good the narrative was or how poor the narrative was actually from both sides in such a major case. Yeah. And it I think given the notoriety and given the just the attention that was brought upon this case when it came about, it was just shocking to me, both from the defense and from the prosecution. The state and the defense were just both. It was surprisingly terrible from both sides, which caught me completely off guard. So do you want to, I guess what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into 3 parts. The first part's going to be looking at the story. The second part's going to be breaking down the evidence. And the third part is giving our verdict on the case and what happened. So without going into too much detail. So Dixon, as you were a bit more familiar with the case, or this was something you were familiar with beforehand, do you want to go through sort of the storyline and what happened on the fateful night that the 2 children were murdered by whomever, let's say?
Sure. And I will say, I know you've given yourself quite an education on it at this point. And so in some senses, feel free to chime in because you may be more familiar even than myself with the case. But it's June the 6th, 1996. It's 2:31 a.m. And the 911 dispatchers in Rowlett, Texas, receive a telephone call from 5801 Eagle Drive, and it's a woman on the end of the line. It's Darlie Routier, and she explains in a fairly hysterical fashion that her home had been broken into, that an intruder had attacked her children, stabbed them, and that her own throat was cut. And, please get over here as soon as possible, obviously was the content of the call, though the call itself becomes part of her narrative because in defense, because she is very hysterical and she screams quite a bit about the condition of her children and, and whether or not they're going to make it. And she, from one perspective, she seems to show a lot of concern for the children in that call, and that will be important to her defense later.
Do you want to hear the call really quick? I have it ready.
Oh, maybe we should play that call again.
Let's have a quick listen to it. It's 5 minutes long, so we'll listen to just the first, I guess, few minutes of it.
Ma'am?
Can you hear that?
I can.
Who's it? Hang on. Hang on, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm trying to get an ambulance to you. Hang on a minute. What's going on, ma'am?
I'll let this one a little longer.
Oh my God! We get it for 601 Eagle Drive, 501 Eagle Drive, the circuit on the phone. The child has been saved. Ma'am, I need you to calm down and talk to me. What? 601 Eagle? Ma'am, listen to me. I need you to. Oh my God! Can you take the radio clip? Yes. Oh my God, ma'am. I need you to talk to me.
I'm going to keep playing this, but I haven't listened to the whole thing. I've only listened to snippets, and
yeah, I haven't listened to it all the way through either. But you cut it right off before I think an interesting part for her defense.
This is what I wanted to get to before we get into that. And for me, it was I heard the call, I think, on a lot of documentaries, and it was a bit. I didn't realize how condensed it was, and how frantic she was in the first. What are we at 143, and she's going absolutely batshit crazy, understandably, because her children are in dire straits. But I think I didn't realize how long that went on beforehand, and how incredible a job the 911 operator did given the circumstance.
Yeah.
All right. Balls. That's pretty funny. We need a producer. We need a producer.
We do need a producer.
I can't understand you. You guys slow down, calm down, and talk to me. What is going on?
And that's this. I just
play
want to
that
point
last.
this out.
Can you play that last before you just
Yeah.
that last sentence of that?
Let's get that on.
Just hit play. Yeah. All right, there we go.
And I think that that's a key piece that's going to come up at some point here with her narrative. So in the one, I don't know what you noticed, but for me, I woke up, I was fighting. And I think this piece here is one of the key pieces that's going to come up in a bit when we discuss this case.
Absolutely. It jumps out. The other thing that jumps out to me, other than the fact that, you know, several times she makes reference to that her babies are dying. Oh my God, Jesus Christ, they're dying. You know what I mean? There is some concern, but also the somewhat odd concern that we got to find out who did this, like that her mind jumps there very quickly. I mean, like this is that, you know, it cuts both ways, right? You, on the one hand, you see the things that would obviously interest the defense, an obvious concern for the welfare of her children. And then if you're the prosecution, that just seems a little out of place, right? That line, like, we got to find out who did this before you even get, you know what I mean? Like that's what she's having. That's where her thoughts are in this crisis moment right now.
And I think when you mentioned crisis moment, I think that makes it really difficult to build a narrative around one way or the other, how a rational person would react in this situation. It's almost impossible to be able to say, this is how a person should react when your children are stabbed and on the floor. And I think that's where it's a little bit difficult.
Absolutely. So should we continue the narrative then, or continue the call?
Should we finish the call here?
All right.
2 minutes in a bit, just because, well, we'll stop it as we go. I think it's probably good we listen to a bunch of this until we get to a point where we feel like we can stop.
Go ahead.
Ma'am, they're with you. Ma'am, is there anybody in the house besides you and your children? My husband is downstairs. He's helping me, but he's dying. Oh my God. Okay, how many little boys? Is it 2 boys? Okay, listen to me. Calm down. Calm. Ma'am, they're on their way. Ma'am, how old are your boys? What? How old are your boys? No. Okay. Oh my God! Oh my God! Calm down, can you? Is your name Darlie? Should I put that down? There's nobody in your head. You don't know who did this?
What I will say is, listening to that, if I knew nothing about this case and I heard that, I would really have a hard time believing she wasn't authentic. You know, the urgency, forgetting everything else with the story, but the urgency, where the cops, you know, just the intensity. It's really hard to keep up that level of emotion, I would think, if you're acting that way. I've listened to other true crime stories where people are acting like they're you know, in serious, I don't know what the word, you know, in dire straits emotionally. And for me, I heard this and it sounded very plausible to me as far as her emotional reaction.
Yeah, I you know, and I am not a trained investigator, but yeah, obviously I'm just going by everyday experience and what I would expect to hear out of somebody who found this kind of horror all around them. And I'm hearing what I expect. Someone who's hysterical, someone who just can't even process what's happening. And where are they? Why aren't they here yet? I mean, yeah, those would be questions I would expect to hear, and you hear them. So I agree with you. There's nothing immediate in this call that would raise any suspicion for me, except for, like I noted earlier, maybe, just maybe, that little, because before she expresses it, mostly before she expresses concern for her kids, there's we got to find out who did this. Like, there's an immediate sort of cast to try to, you know, move suspicion to the third party.
Yeah.
That is maybe, but I don't know. I mean, again, I kind of agree with you. It's hard to say what someone might say in a circumstance like this.
Yeah, I agree. I will stop it at a place that I think we both know about. So that was that's going to come into play in a bit as part of, we're going over evidence, but that was a big part of the case. There's a knife. I picked it up already. And the prosecution made the point, why is she worried about the fingerprints and why is she worried about the knife? What did you think about that?
I get the sense that somewhere along in the investigation, she actually raised the issue of fingerprints. That would tend to make me think a little suspiciously. This does not. You know what I mean? Like, you wake up, there's blood everywhere. You see a knife on the I mean, that's just a natural kind of, like, if you see a sharp knife on the kitchen floor, what do? You pick it up, especially if you have a house with kids. Yeah. Or dogs, or anybody who might, or hell, yourself. You know what I mean? Like, that wouldn't bother me for even an instant. Basically, she says there's a knife. They're telling her, understandably, don't touch it, and all she hears says is, "Well, I already touched it," which I've
ruined it. I agree with that, and I think this is one of the things the prosecution hammered on a little bit. That why is she so concerned in this moment where her children are dying that she's touched the knife, and it's plausible, whether you agree with it or not. It's plausible that she has concerns about catching this person at some point, and you can argue when that's appropriate. But again, it's really difficult in this situation to know what's appropriate for anybody.
Right.
Exactly. I don't know. Okay, ma'am, listen. There's a police officer. Your front door unlocked? Yes, ma'am. Listen, okay. Very creepy. I was getting here.
So I don't remember that she was asking for the ambulance. Where's the ambulance? Where's the ambulance?
Right.
I didn't remember hearing that.
Okay, is 82 out on Eagle?
So I think we can move on from that. But I didn't listen to that all the way through, like I said, and that call was way more compelling listening to it through right there than it was, I guess, before I'd listened to that.
I hadn't listened to it straight through either, and chopping it up does reduce its effectiveness. And I don't think it was used effectively at trial either, because it's a certain counterpoint to some of the stuff that we'll get to in a few minutes that was used in building the case against her.
Yeah. Well, the police are here. Do you want to pick up where we left off? So we've
absolutely
got, just so I understand, we have just to summarize here. She said she woke up. She was fighting. Somebody stabbed her babies. They ran out the kitchen door, and she's calling for the police, calling for the ambulance. Somebody's there. I'll pass it back to you, sir.
Right. So the police arrive, and first, of course, they clear the house to ensure that there is no one in the house before the paramedics are allowed in. And as I understand it, there is, and I've read different things, but either 3 or 5 minutes it takes from the time of the 911 call, and we just had it up, till the time that police and paramedics arrive. I think it's 5 total once you include, because I think the police arrive at about the 3-minute mark, and it takes them another minute and a half. So within 5 minutes, the paramedics are inside, and that becomes important later, again, as a timeline question. So the paramedics are inside. They obviously begin to work on the children, and Routier tells the police, as she mentions, you can hear her say it on the call we just listened to, that the assailant went through the garage. Out in the garage, they did find a screened-in window where the screen had been cut, which would imply, obviously, that someone came into or out of, or both, through that exit that was created, or entrance that was created. And once they have the children secured and start combing around the scene, obviously there's a tremendous amount of blood evidence in the house. The other thing that in scouring the area looking for this potential intruder, they discover 75 yards away from the house down an alley, a bloody sock that had the blood of the two boys on it, down about 75 yards away from the house. And again, that becomes an important piece of evidence.
And I have actually the map of the sock location versus the actual. So this is their house here. This is the location of the sock. So it's, yeah, I think it was 75 yards there. So 150 yards total there and back, the distance, I guess. Yeah.
And so for that night, obviously, Darlie, is wounded herself. That's the other piece. And she would later claim that, she got up, she was awakened presumptively by the fact that she was in some kind of a struggle with the intruder or heard something finally. And when she awoke, she was aware of a man. The one thing that she didn't, here on the 911 call, she says she's fighting, but that fighting is not something that she pushes too hard, really.
No.
It's something that she just kind of generally, so she went towards him. She came after him, and then she saw him retreat. And then she, only after she chased him out of the house, found the knife on the floor, all of that, did she notice that she herself was cut and bleeding. But she had tremendous wounds, and I see you've put the picture up if you guys are watching, for those watching on YouTube. So she had a deep gash in her neck. She had a gash on her arm. The gash on her neck was considered, the prosecution would later try to claim it was superficial. Obviously, the defense response to that was that it was within a 1/16 of an inch of her carotid artery, which obviously, if she had hit, she would have exsanguinated more than likely. She had bruises. I don't know if you have that photo, but her arms are also heavily bruised, her right arm in particular. So she looked a mess. I mean, she did. Although I guess compared to, I guess what's notable about this, if you're being notable, is that the boys were stabbed. She was slashed.
Yeah.
And there is a difference between them
too.
Okay.
So she had, there was a stab mark. So this is a stab mark here. Well, I believe it was advertised as a stab mark. We're going to go into this. Actually, I'm going to save part of the detail of this because I learned a bit about this. It isn't quite what we thought.
Okay.
But there was the way it was, in the report as part of that storyline, she was stabbed here and here. And then on the arm, actually, I don't have a picture of it, but on the arm, she had a gash on her right arm. It was a defensive. Yeah. Up here, you can see the edge of the bandage, a defensive mark that went in just about to the bone. I think it went in about a half an inch. There's not much room between the skin and the bone. So it's a stab wound that looked like it was her protecting herself at that stage. So and the bruising, which is going to be notable later.
Yes. So really, after they cleared the scene, determined there was no intruder around to be found at that point, found the sock, secured everything. What happened next was they obviously began an investigation. One thing that became a bone of contention was how evidence was handled in this case. This was obviously a smaller police department. Now, the police department, one of the things that you can watch on this, and here's a shout out to all my friends in Unsolved Mysteries land. And I post regularly on the Sitcoms Online Unsolved Mysteries message board. And this has been, that segment has been much discussed there.
Yeah.
And the officer says, listen, we're not a bunch of country rubes who just fell off the wagon here. Yeah, we know how to investigate and handle evidence. And so, the Routier camp claims that the evidence, it was put into, and I think from, the perspective of a layperson, that evidence was put in brown paper bags and put, stored in a fire station while they, were first clearing the scene. It does sound a little like, I don't know, doesn't sound like 100% professional handling, but at the same time, what do I know? You know what I mean? Like I would say to that,
we have to take their word for it. We have to.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, there's some chain of custody questions there, but pretty quickly, the police focused their investigation on Darlie. They clear the husband relatively quickly. Of course, his story is that the entire time this was going on, he was asleep upstairs with their youngest son, because they did have 3 sons. Yeah. And he was awakened by Darlie's screams. And prior to that, he heard nothing. And that's when he enters the scene, and you hear him enter sort of into the situation in the 911 call. He's cleared pretty quickly as a suspect. The police believe his story. They do not believe Darlie. They start building a case against her. And several days after Darren was, not Darren, excuse me, which of the boys was to turn, Damon was to turn 7.
Yeah.
And I think 3 days after the murders, I think his birthday was June the 9th. And so they, the children were buried, and they wound up having this little birthday party, for lack of a better term, at the grave site. Yes. Which of course became, really one of the key features of this case is video of that ceremony, and specifically the end of it, where Darlie and others, but specifically Darlie, is spraying silly string and acting, certainly when you first see it, I think it makes your eyes pop a little bit that, how is this what she's doing 3 or 4 days after her son has been murdered? It was 8 days, excuse me. The thing was 8 days after, and I think we have the video here.
Yeah, we've been I've been shit hot today with my my special effects. We've had
you are.
While we've been going over it.
What are we going to do when we upload this on the podcast websites? This is an audio medium, we have theater of the mind here.
If you're listening to this on the audio, just to give, let's actually say what it is though. She's had her 2 boys have been stabbed in what is a traumatic event. Mm-hmm. And there is a roughly 90-second clip, maybe less, where they decided, her and her family, I think it was her sister's idea, decided it was Devon. I believe it was Devon, you're saying. He loved silly string. The boys loved to play with silly string. And to celebrate his life and you see it at his actual gravestone. This is 8 days after they were killed, after 8 days after Darlie was attacked with a knife. They're celebrating and spraying silly string all over a bunch of birthday balloons right around his gravesite. And she's smiling. The husband is there looking quite not sure about it, but he's there supporting the family. There's just lots of smiles and happiness. And I think at that point, if I can just sort of jump in, Greg Davis, I remember he's the prosecutor. I saw an interview, and it might have even been on Unsolved Mysteries as well, to the crew, where he said he watched it and he was just, dumbfounded as to how somebody could do that. And at that point, I think he made a decision. This person is guilty based on these events. And this was a central part of the case when we get into the evidentiary side of this.
Yeah.
So this was a massive part of the case.
It certainly was.
And I think the notable point is this was part of a whole day of events that they had. There was a whole prayer day.
Yes.
And actually, one thing that we won't be able to talk about because it never was entered into evidence, the police weren't able to present some evidence they illegally took. They had hidden cameras and hidden microphones at the gravesite. And some of the evidence they didn't play was Darlie crying, at her son's grave, sounding absolutely besides herself.
Right. And I've read that as well. And obviously the Routier camp claims that, when you see the entire context, I think one of the things they said was that they invited because the birthday party had been planned and everything had been ready to go. Invitations had been sent out. And so the family made this decision that kids who had purchased things could come and pay their respects and give the present at the gravesite. Yeah. But they wanted to hold it together. Now I have to say that sounds awfully grim to me. Like I can't imagine, like, what I mean? That's such at the same time though, you can't sit here it's hard to parse that because, you could say to yourself, aha, evidence of greedy parents or greedy people who are indifferent to suffering. But, these are a bunch of kids who bought some toys for another kid. There's nothing of value in those presents to an adult. So you're not collecting this stuff for its, you know, it's not some kind of move like, well, we killed grandma and everyone, you know, rich grandma and everyone had a birthday present for her and we still want those presents. So
yeah, we're going to sell them on eBay.
Right. Yeah. You know, when grandma got run over by a reindeer or whatever, that it's a completely different situation.
Yeah.
So it's not the choice I would make, but again, you know, it's hard to parse. Is that as creepy as it seems, or is that just something that, you know, God only knows what would be going through your mind if you're that beside yourself with grief in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, it is unusual, and it is, you know, I've listened to interviews of people who've lost children, and they were disgusted by that. And I also parsed that with the best party I went to, and I can remember in my life, was when my grandfather passed away, and we had a wake, and we got absolutely shit faced, and it was one of the greatest parties I'd ever been to.
Right.
Now that's a little bit different than 8 days. I think the issue is with the trauma, and I think part of
I think the issue is with the age of the victim. You know, like when an old person who's been suffering and has had their life passes away, you know, it's easy to think of the wake as a celebration of life. You know, I mean, there's going to be a sadness, but like certainly if I make it to 75, 80, 85, I sure hope anybody who's left behind, you know, pours one out, toasts one up. You know what I mean? Like I don't want it. I mean, don't also shed a tear. Please remember that I was a human being, but like, you know, remember the good times too, right? You know, having said that, you know, but when it's a small child, I mean, it's just, it changes the tone. So in ways that you can't calculate. I actually have been once to a viewing for a 6-year-old child, and there's an experience I don't ever want again.
Yeah. And there's a few ways to look at that, because it could be so traumatic that, you know, as it is, and this is going to connect into the whole reasonable doubt piece. It is perfectly feasible that somebody is so traumatized by something that they're blocking out anything negative to do with it and focusing on positive things and trying to stay happy. It's also possible that Darlie is a complete psychopath, but being a psychopath does not mean that you are a murderer. Those two are not mutually exclusive, and that one doesn't prove anything else. So, and Integrity's back with us. How you doing, my friend? It's unusual, no doubt. I don't know if you can blame someone for doing what they can to try and experience one final positive experience with their child, and that's a fair point. You know, it's unusual though, and it's something that maybe the cops are like, this is something we should maybe keep an eye on, but it's not a reason to put someone on death row, nor is it a reason.
I don't know. No, you'll go ahead.
And nor is it a reason to focus an entire investigation on one person.
You know, I would go one further. I mean, honestly, if I were her attorney, I would be jumping up and down and screaming to keep that video out of the trial. To my eye, and if I were the judge, I never would have allowed it in. It is simply not relevant. You know what I mean? Like, it's not relevant. It's not relevant to, you know, the question of whether or not she committed the murders. That has no evidentiary value whatsoever. It doesn't shed any light positively or negatively on her guilt or innocence. It doesn't offer anything. It only is there to make you think, oh, what a bitch. You know what I mean? That's what it's there to do from the prosecution's perspective.